Welcome back, and on to another conflict now. At least 40 people have been killed after an Israeli airstrike hit a United Nations school in central Gaza. The shelter, packed with hundreds of displaced people, is believed to contain some Hamas militants, according to the Israeli Defense Forces, but Hamas has rejected the claims. In a statement, the IDF said jets had conducted what it called a precise strike on a Hamas compound embedded inside the UN school in the area of Nosriat. The IDF also noted it had taken steps before the airstrike to reduce the risk of harming uninvolved civilians. Hamas has condemned the strike, accusing Israel of committing a horrific massacre. Well, Switzerland's National Council has rejected a proposal to recognize Palestine as a state at the parliament's lower house, a motion which was introduced by Zurich-based Social Democratic Party Fabian Moliner and had 192 votes in total. 131 people voted against, 61 MPs voted in favor, while only 2 abstained. Swiss Foreign Minister Ignazio Cassis spoke against the move, claiming that there was no clear will in the chamber to change the country's foreign policy. Other European countries such as Slovenia, Ireland, Norway, and Spain have moved to recognize Palestine in recent weeks. Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said it sends the message that terrorism pays, while both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas welcomed the announcement. On the other hand, Spain says it will ask the International Court of Justice for permission to join South Africa's case accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. Foreign Minister Jose Manuel Alvarez says it's because of the ongoing military operation in Gaza. Spain is the first European country to take the step after South Africa filed its case with the International Court of Justice late last year. It alleged that Israel was breaching the Genocide Convention and its military assault in Gaza. Mexico, Colombia, Nicaragua, Libya, and the Palestinians have already requested to join the case. Back in May, Spain, Norway, and Ireland formally recognized a Palestinian state in a coordinated effort by the 3 Western European nations to add international pressure on Israel. The ICJ has ordered Israel to immediately halt its military offensive in the southern Gaza city of Rafah, but stopped short of ordering a ceasefire for the enclave. Israel has not complied. Israel denies it is committing genocide in its military operation to crush Hamas, triggered by its deadly October 7 attack in southern Israel. Now, the U.S. Republican-led House of Representatives passed a legislation this week. It would impose sanctions on the International Criminal Court over its prosecutors' decision to seek arrest warrants for Israeli officials related to the war in Gaza. A vote was 247 to 155, with 42 Democrats joining Republicans in backing the measure. There were no Republican nay votes, although 2 voted present. Joining us now is the VOA's Patsy Widakuswara, who joins us from Washington. Patsy, great to see you. And the U.S. is not signatory to the ICC, so how exactly is this vote expected to impact on any ICC decision?
Well, the short answer is that, first of all, it's unlikely to pass. This is just the first step. This passed in the House of Representatives. It still has to go through the Senate, where it's unlikely to pass because there's more Democrats and Republicans there. And also, the White House has strongly opposed the sanctions measures taken up by the House. So by and large, this is a much more a messaging bill rather than a substantive bill. And so in terms of impact, there is likely not much. If it passes, if it becomes law, and even then, it's very unlikely to become law.
Right, and the ICC members have in the past decried the fact that the U.S. citizens have not been prosecuted by the court. They've also not been, the court has never had any reason to prosecute the U.S. officials or service members when you talk about wars fought in different parts of the world that U.S. military has been involved in. Why should the court then take any notice of what U.S. lawmakers are doing, or should they even take notice of what the lawmakers are doing?
Well, it's certainly a signal of displeasure by some American lawmakers, particularly on the Republican side. I should note that there is broad bipartisan support for Israel in both Republican and Democratic Party, but there's definitely much more unqualified support for Israel's actions in Gaza from the Republican Party. So this is a signal of displeasure from American lawmakers, even though it may not really achieve much in terms of substance and impact. It is a signal. Having said that, the U.S. relationship with the ICC has been very nuanced and very complex over the years, as you know, even though they don't support ICC's investigations ICC's decision on Israel. They have been supportive of other cases. So, this is something that certainly shows much more to the point of U.S. lawmakers' support for Israel.
When the negotiations between Israel and Hamas started, and you had U.S. officials oscillating between Israel and Israeli neighbors and going to Saudi Arabia and going to Qatar and speaking to Hamas and trying to get everybody on board with a ceasefire, it was a bit confusing about where exactly the United States stood. And then the U.S. said it would not support Israel when it ventured into Rafah. And it became, quite unclear where the U.S. support is for Israel, and then it said you can't use American weapons on Hamas, on killing innocent civilians. But this is a clear sign that U.S. lawmakers are behind the government, isn't it, as it supports Israel?
Well, that's a big question, right? So if we want to break it out specifically in terms of sanctions on the ICC, this is something that Republican lawmakers support. 40 Democratic lawmakers support, the White House does not support. In terms of broader support for Israel and in terms of the ceasefire itself, this is for sure something that President Biden is pushing for. As you mentioned, his top aides are right now in the region trying to pressure Hamas to accept the ceasefire deal that President Biden himself announced last week on behalf of Israel. I mean, the U.S. is saying that this is an Israeli proposal, something that has been signed off by Israeli war cabinet. But the fact of the matter, President Biden is the one who is announcing it to the world and basically, forcing Benjamin Netanyahu's hand to decide what he wants to do. Does he want to go ahead with this ceasefire plan that would see the release of some Israeli hostages and some Palestinians detained in Israeli jails for a period of calm cessation of hostilities? The initial phase is 6 weeks. That will continue to a much more permanent ceasefire if things go well. This is something that the White House has been pushing for, something that is supported by, beyond the United States. G7 countries have signed on it. We see that there's a resolution proposed by the U.S. in the UN Security Council to support it. So this is something in terms of whether the U.S. supports Israel. Yes, in terms of providing military and financial support for Israel's effort to root out Hamas. Yes, in terms of trying to figure out a way to stop the war and provide more aid to Palestinians and release Israeli hostages. But specifically about the topic that you mentioned earlier in terms of sanction for ICC court, that's a much more divisive issue in the U.S. Congress. And as I mentioned before, more of a messaging bill from the Republican side.
Now, Patsy, you've talked a bit about President Biden's three-phase ceasefire proposal, which Israel has finally agreed to. But the Israeli government did give a caveat. They said they would agree to a ceasefire if Hamas also agrees to a ceasefire, to the terms of the ceasefire. Now, so far, there's been no response from the Hamas group regarding the ceasefire. How does the U.S. government hope to go about convincing Hamas that this is the best deal?
Well, I think the U.S. is trying to convince both sides, not just Hamas, right? Because right now there is still a vast difference between Israel and Hamas about what ceasefire actually means. And many of the analysts that I spoke to have said that it's very likely they can only get through the first phase of the deal, which is 6 weeks ceasefire, 6 weeks of cessation of hostilities. Beyond that, it's much more complicated because within this first 6 weeks, there will be an exchange of some Israeli hostages, particularly, women, wounded, children, the elderly, and so on. But the rest of these, Israel male young men hostages, they're going to be still held by Hamas because what else is the leverage from Hamas if these hostages are released? So that's the big key issue here, is in terms of whether or not this is going to lead to permanent ceasefire, which is a guarantee that Hamas is asking from Israel, and Israel has not provided. And from the Israel side, they are still insisting that the goal of this war is to completely destroy Hamas governing and military capability. They want Hamas to have nothing to do with the future of Gaza, and they have said that there is no way they're going to agree to a ceasefire until that goal has been achieved. So it's a very existential survival problem from both sides, and it's really hard to get the two sides to meet beyond the 6 weeks first phase that even now have still not been reached yet.
Patsy, thanks again for joining us.
Pleasure.